The government's role is to manage and regulate federal public lands. This involves the use, allotment, and preservation of lands. Per the Constitution and its Property Clause, Congress has the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations regarding federal lands. Congress delegates federal land management to the Department of Interior and its Bureau of Land Management, which implements policies that influence public land management. Let's begin with a map of all the land owned by the federal government. There are almost 200 million acres of federal lands, which comprise about one-third of the total national land surface area. The federal government owns land in every state, but most of the federally owned land is in the West, in Alaska, as you can see here. The public land management system is broken into four major areas. The first are general public lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Then there are national forests managed by the U.S. Forest Service. Then there are national wildlife refuges managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And finally, national parks and wilderness areas managed by the National Park Service. When it comes to general public lands and national forests, the government applies a multiple-use doctrine. As the name implies, this doctrine seeks to balance several interests, from economic interests to recreational ones. It's highly subject to political influence and tends to swing from pro-business to pro-environment, depending on the political party in power. Some of the attributes of the multiple-use doctrine include making the most judicious use of some or all of the resources, striking a balance among those parties that want to use the area. This includes considering the value of each group's interests, and these factors allow for great deference to the federal manager. For national wildlife refuges, the federal government applies a dominant use doctrine. First, the dominant consideration is protection of wildlife. As long as this need is met first, then other uses such as recreation or economic uses are allowed, but only if compatible with the purpose for which the refuge was established. This is a map of the national wildlife refuges around the country. You can see that the locations are fairly distributed throughout the entire country. For national parks and national wilderness areas, Congress imposed a preservation doctrine, which aims to preserve, as the name suggests, these areas. The major economic resources on public lands include water, minerals, timber, range for cattle feeding and hunting wildlife, but also include non-economic benefits derived from recreation, preservation, and aesthetic appreciation. The Forest Service sells the timber, but not for profit. It must conduct a cost-benefit analysis to determine the suitability of land for timber production. Under the Mineral Leasing Act, the Secretary of Interior can lease lands for fossil fuel development. These coal leases are sold through a competitive bidding process or a fixed royalty rate. Leasing for mineral deposits was banned by Congress in the 1980s after a famous case of a foreign company making millions of dollars in profits in mineral sales on a lease that only costs a few dollars. Grazing rights require a permit from the Forest Service, and these permits were distributed in 1934, which established a baseline for how much land the cattle can graze on. National monuments have a use designation similar to national parks, which is an absolute preservation doctrine. The major distinction between national monuments and other public lands described above is that national monuments can be designated by an executive order by the President. 14 presidents have used the Antiquities Act to establish 122 national monuments covering 70 million acres across 28 states. The courts have upheld the discretion of the president in setting aside areas for national monuments under the Antiquities Act. You're probably familiar with national monuments because of the controversy over Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, pictured here. President Obama created a national monument at this location under the Antiquities Act, and then President Trump reduced the monument's size. It's an interesting development because this redesignation has never happened before and has been challenged in court. I'll leave you with the Antiquities Act. It's very brief and can be broken into these two sections. The first part essentially grants the authority to the president. In this second part, the key words that the court will examine comes down to a factual interpretation of how much area is needed for protection under a proper care and management review. It can't be any larger than what is needed.